So the purpose of this event today, right, really is to talk about the continued use of detention without trial in Singapore. This is particularly relevant not just because it's the 50th anniversary of Operation Coldstore, which was really the first major use of detention by the PAP government, as well as the single largest use of it, but also because the Criminal Law Temporary Provisions Act has just been renewed. So together with the ISA, these two laws permit detention without trial. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by providing historical context to talk about Operation Coldstore, to talk about this first use of detention without trial, and then we'll segue into a roundtable discussion about all the role of detention in Singapore today. But before I go on, I'd just like to point out that this year is also 50 years of the independence of Singapore. Now, the government will have you think that 1965 is the anniversary, but it's actually 1963. We became independent from the British Empire on 16th of September 1963, and I think it's really important that we remember that we entered into Malaysia as an independent, sovereign part of Malaysia, rather than continuing to be part of some sort of colonial structure. We were an independent country in 63, and we continued to be so after 65, but on our own instead of part of Malaysia. So this 50 years is also a great time to stop and reflect and take stock. So that's what I hope we can all do today. So let's start with the basics. All right, what is Operation Coldstore? It was launched about 1:25 a.m., 2nd of February 1963, and on that very first day, 111 people were arrested and detained without trial. Most of these people included all the leaders of Singapore's opposition. All the capable leaders of Singapore's political opposition were detained indefinitely, some like Dr. Ho for decades. Right? And it wiped out Singapore's progressive left. It wiped out a lot of the opposition in Singapore. At the time, Singapore's internal security was in the hands of an internal security council, which comprised 3 members of the Singapore government, 3 members of the British colonial government, and 1 member from the Federation of Malaya. Their explanation for why the arrest happened was basically communism, violence, and it was anti-Malaysia. But the problem is, right, in the historiography, in our historical understanding, we see these events through the eyes of the British, through the eyes of the English-speaking leaders of the PAP. It's a very one-sided historiography, and it's a major issue for us to be able to have any sort of really clear understanding of these events, that we also bring in other voices, other perspectives. So we don't actually know what the Barisan believed. We don't know what the progressive left believed. So one of my goals with my talk today really is to try and help us understand what were the beliefs of the Barisan. Why did they act the way they did? Why did they make the choices that they did? And then try and resituate them into the broader narrative of merger and Malaysia. To begin with, let's look at our main actors. Can everyone see these clearly? Everyone good? Over there on your top left is Commissioner Selkirk, who was the British proconsul, the plenipotentiary in Singapore. Right? Top right, Tunku Abdul Rahman, the first Prime Minister of independent Malaya. Bottom left, our friend Mr. Lee. And bottom right, Lim Chin Siong, the spiritual leader of the progressive left, the intellectual leader, and also Secretary General of the Barisan Socialists. Now, to give some structure to what I'm going to talk about, okay, I'm going to go into a bit of theory. Don't be daunted, all right? It's very basic. But I'm going to start by talking about the work of early 20th century sociologist Karl Mannheim. Now, for Mannheim, right, he defined a generation as being born from shared historical disruption. People are disproportionately influenced by the events that happen to them in their most malleable plastic years, so the late teens to mid-20s. So what defines a political generation is the history that people experience during those years. And it's important to note that a generation has no set length. All right, you can have a generation every year, you can have it one every 100 years. But what matters is that people experience during their lifetime a defining event that ends up defining their generation. And this defining event is different from the defining event that defines the next generation and the previous generation. Also, people can experience the same very formative events, but have very different responses to it. So as a basic example, think of the Thatcher years in Britain, right? Very formative, defining event, but people responded to it in such drastically different ways. So, let's then, with this in mind, take a look at the events in Singapore from around the year 1930. What we see is a pattern of systemic discrimination and repression of Singaporeans, particularly of the Chinese-speaking. They grew up in a time where not only does the colonial state fail to protect them economically and politically, but the resources of the state are turned against them. Repression, discrimination, and violence, again and again and again. So, to be Chinese-speaking in Singapore in 1949 is, in my mind, not that far from being Palestinian in East Jerusalem today. You're a second-class citizen in the land of your birth. Obviously, this comparison is problematic, but I think it gives you an idea of the kind of discrimination and state violence that's turned on you. So, for someone like Lim Chin Siong and his friends Chen Sei-jing and Fong Swee-Suan, they were at Chinese High together, and they experienced this firsthand in 1951. The government ordered them to take a useless exam, right? It had no purpose. It would not help them go on to the next level, would not have any influence on their grades. The government just decided, you need to take this exam. And they protested, and they said no. And for their pains, they were detained. Some of their friends were tortured, and at the exam, 80 of them out of over 100 turned in blank exam scripts and were all promptly expelled. So because of this very arbitrary act, their livelihoods were destroyed. Right? They could no longer get decent jobs, they couldn't go to university. Instead, Lim Chin Siong ends up becoming a bus conductor. Their prospects are completely ruined. So, the same happens to other members of this generation. Let's have a look at the Barisan Socialist Central Committee here. Okay? And let's refine this list. Let's take out anyone who wasn't on the Operation Coldstore arrest list. And if you look at it closely, basically everyone arrested at Operation Coldstore was born in a narrow 5-year period, centered around 1932. So you have a very strong political generation who are all defined by a long shared historical experience. And this historical disruption defines them, it defines what they believed, it defines how they felt and against the colonial state. But they overcame this discrimination. They overcame this oppression and they pushed back against the government. So the government won't let you study in the University of Malaya? Fine, we'll start our own university, Nanyang University. The government encourages the exploitation of wage labor? Fine, we'll organize the trade unions, we'll strike, and we'll vote in a labor-friendly government at the first opportunity, which is what happened in 1955. And in that same year, you see the first legislation which actually protects the rights of workers. And in that same year, you see all these strikes which actually win important concessions from employers for workers. So it is because of this immense strength of this organization that they build up in the 50s that the PAP then ends up winning the elections in 1959. But by the time the PAP wins these elections in 1959, many of these same people are behind bars. The government, the colonial government, is able to destroy a lot of their gains by using violence and oppression against them. In 1956, they stopped the first multi-ethnic civil rights movements in its tracks by just arresting all the leaders and locking them away for several years. The laws which enabled this, of course, were the internal security laws. So the lesson that this generation drew from this is that it doesn't really matter what you do, as long as the British hold on to internal security laws, no matter what other powers they cede, they can just stop you in your tracks. And they will continue to govern Singapore for the benefit of the British electorate, the British economy, not the Singaporean electorate and the Singapore economy. So it doesn't really matter what aspect of life in Singapore you're talking about. The detainee issue, the internal security issue, is not just a political issue. It impacts every single aspect of your life in Singapore. And this is what Lim said some years later. So it doesn't matter what the issue is, right? It doesn't matter whether you succeed, unless it doesn't matter whether you succeed if the British can just arrest what they want. So when they get out in 1959, the number one priority is to put the internal security laws in the hands of a locally elected, fully democratic government that is completely responsible to the people of Singapore. That's their number one priority, along with, of course, releasing the political detainees who are already behind bars. Note here that they don't actually call for the abolition of the laws, but instead, if the people of Singapore want these laws, that's fine, but it has to be in the hands of a government which is democratically elected and fully representative and responsible to the people of Singapore. Without this, there can be no economic progress, no educational progress. But having gotten the PAP elected, and throughout their first year, they try to work with the PAP leadership. But the problem is, throughout the course of the first year, the PAP really make a hash of things. There is a lot of poor performance. As Lisa mentioned, they're revolutionaries. They come out and they implement a lot of policies quickly, designed to make a lot of changes. But this leads to policy implemented in haste and then regretted at leisure. There's a lot of embarrassing U-turns. Crime goes up the first year, wages go down, the housing situation remains critical. Most notably, there is the sudden revocation of the Trade Unions Bill. After the PAP members, led by Lim Chin Siong, put in so much effort to reorganize the trade union movement, the government realizes that they can't control the trade union movement, that it could become an alternative power base. So even though the Trade Unions Bill has already been passed, right, the PAP cabinet orders Yusof Ishak not to sign it and pulls the whole thing back and destroys all this hard work for the first year. So there's a lot of frustration and anger in the rank and file of the PAP. But it's not limited to just them. This is what the British said. Okay, I'll give you a moment to have a look at it. There's a lot of frustration. They acknowledge the PAP leadership has a difficult job. They have to balance the interests of capital, of companies, versus the interests of labor and of the people of Singapore. They have to balance the interests of the British colonial power versus the Singapore people. They have to keep promises